Hello and welcome to the Rock's Back Pages podcast. I'm sat here with Mr. Mark Pringle.
Hi, Barney.
And Mr. Jasper Murison Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
Hello, comrades.
Hello.
Yes.
Good day.
Good day. Today we'll be talking about American folk country troubadour John Prine and featured writer Mike Barnes. But we're going to start with the suave gentleman known variously as Byron Ferrari, Bryan Ferry, Byron Ferry, and Friern Barnet, but who today we'll call by his actual name, which is Mark.
I've forgotten it now. Bryan Ferry. What's brilliant about all those names, most of which are coined by the NME, is they got under his skin. He really didn't like it. You know, this is a man who doesn't have much sense of humour towards himself.
I'll certainly be referring to him as Byron Ferrari all that.
Throughout the podcast. So the reason we're talking about Bryan Ferry, the lead singer of Roxy Music, is because they've just, who they are, but someone's just released a live album of a show he did in December 1974 at the Royal Albert Hall.
Some bloke at the back of a white van that's just released.
No, I think it is a legitimate record company. So it's the first solo shows he did. I mean, Roxy Music was still going, but he had released, at that point, 2 albums of cover songs.
2 fairly ghastly albums of cover songs.
Well, we'll talk about that, shall we? So These Foolish Things, with its title track, courtesy of Cole Porter, had come out in 73. And then Another Time, Another Place came out in 74. And, you know, this was a very different Bryan Ferry to, let's say, the guy that we saw on Top of the Pops singing Virginia Plain.
Very, very, very different Bryan Ferry. And, I mean, he did the second worst version of Jealous Guy. The worst being the original version by John Lennon, and by far the best being Donny Hathaway's.
Yeah, that's a great version.
You know, but the second worst version of Jealous Guy.
Well, no, I was a huge Roxy fan.
Me too.
You were a Roxy fan as well, and so I bought These Foolish Things because it was Bryan Ferry, and you know,
it was
looking back
instantly.
Well, looking back all these years, did I really want to hear Bryan singing, you know, Dylan's Heartbrain's Carnival, or Smoke Gets in My Eyes?
It's my party and
It's my party. I mean, there were a lot of cover albums being done in those days.
Yes, Bowie done pin-ups.
Everyone had to do a covers
same
album.
time. Well, I think, but was Bowie's pin-ups the first?
It predated These Foolish Things, I think.
And I think
both 73.
Yes, it sort of set the tone for it. I mean, Roxy Music were just such an exciting act when they first emerged. I think their second album, which is name entirely escapes me, For Your Pleasure, is just a great, great record. I roaded for Roxy Music at the Slough Community Centre in early 72.
It's like Adolf Hitler, my pass in his downfall,
exactly.
isn't it, really, with Mike?
Because my art teacher, John Ragg, was their roadie. In fact, in the first album, it says Transport by Ragg. So he dragged me along, and I realised I couldn't pick up a Fender Twin Reverb amplifier. I was too spindly to do that. but
so
no,
sad.
I mean, my school, Holland Park School, Andy McKay taught woodwind instruments in the music department. Eno came to demonstrate the VCS3 synthesizer and got chased out by skinheads shouting, "You puff!" I see.
Those were the days.
So Roxy Music almost like a house band for my school. You know, they sort of belonged to us in a curious kind of way. And Virginia Plain was such a startlingly brilliant record.
Well, they were so futuristic, weren't they? Yeah. And so when Bryan did these covers albums, it seemed awfully sort of retrogressive.
Well, it pointed out what he fundamentally was, which was fairly reactionary. Yes, he had that sort of art school futurism. He was at art school himself. But in the end, I mean, Roxy Music themselves became a more and more reactionary band. They became a sort of more and more middle of the road.
They wanted hits in America and got them.
Yeah, but also I think ultimately that was his taste emerging.
Yes. He was a smooth operator, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Probably too smooth. And actually the first of the pieces to do with this is actually a review of one of those shows. I think he actually did 3 shows at the Albert Hall. And this is the wonderfully catty Philip Norman.
Oh, he's great.
Reviewing for the Times. And so he sets the scene. The better boxes were filled with the fashionable elite of rock music, vigorously semaphoring their prestige and their exclusiveness. Wonderful. And then he writes of Bryan, it engages our attention that a man wearing evening dress and hairdressing should sway and bend his knees in the execution of a rock song. It surprises us that a voice little stronger than that of a guard's subaltern on amateur night should be exercised upon the songs of Brian Wilson, Chris Christopherson and Stevie Wonder. Ooh, ouch.
Actually, it occurs to me that Philip Norman is the British John Mendelssohn in a way, because I barely read a positive review, and he wrote for the Times in sort of the mid-70s.
Yes.
I've barely read a single positive review of his.
It's very elegant to stay.
Yeah. Remember I read that one, his review of Barry White on one of the podcasts a few weeks back. That was absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
Except for Lloyd Bradley looking slightly glowering over the top of the microphone at me while I read it. But moving on.
Well, so the second piece is an interview that Max Bell of The Enemy actually did with The Enemy. You mentioned them earlier. Did just before these shows, and he's kind of asking Bryan about them, and Bryan says, I haven't been there yet. I'm not going until they push me on stage. I think he clearly was quite nervous about this. But the title of the piece really sums up The Enemy's attitude to Byron Ferrari. It's a picture of him wearing a kind of tweed jacket and a tie, and it's titled, Tired of That Same Old Anorak? Achieve the country life look in a comfy tweed blazer, by Ferrari of South Kensington. I mean, they had really decided that he was preposterous.
Well, I think it's partly because he seemed to take himself so seriously.
Yeah.
And also he was a really humorless interviewee. And I've read a lot of interviews, and my job is... and this is a man... Well, he always strikes me as being a bit depressive.
Do you know what? I think you're right. I think he is... I mean, I've only interviewed him once, and I found him both quite depressed and quite humorless.
Good combination.
But which is bizarre when you think about the sort of the wit and space age genius of the lyrics on those first.
I mean, Roxy music are
albums.
neither depressing nor humorless.
I think Bryan, a bit like Mick Jagger, Bryan became very enamoured of, shall we say, the English upper classes, and indeed married into them. And he, for what was he? I mean, he grew up in Newcastle.
That's right.
You know, and I don't know why all this seemed so impressive to him, but it just did.
Well, it does to... There are quite a few people from, let's say, essentially kind of working class or lower middle class backgrounds who are impressed by the
Jagger's never really got over it.
Well, Jagger was almost part of it in the first place, you know. I mean,
because Jagger was not exactly middle class guy, so I don't think it's sort of limited to...
I mean...
You know, it's not a sort of looking upwards necessarily from working class or middle class individuals.
I think Ferry really bought into it.
People do buy into it.
And it also ended up either skewing or either creation of or creating his own fairly politically reactionary attitudes, exemplified by his hunting son, for example.
Yeah.
You know, there's something I think was always already there, and that his wealth and his position allowed him to marry into and kind of become part of that sort of thing, which I find pretty nauseating myself.
Max notes that, so the Roxy album, Country Life, the fourth Roxy album, had come out earlier that year. And Max says, claims that Country Life was named after an obscure reference to metaphysical poet John Donne are incorrect. In fact, the riddle is solved by a brief look around Bryan's front room, where 3 or 4 copies of the famous magazine of that name are scattered.
Yep.
So, I mean, there we are. You know, this is 2 years after Virginia Plain and Remake, Remodel, and he's reading Country Life.
Wasn't one of your good friends his brother-in-law for a stretch?
One of our writers, Edward Hammill, was his brother-in-law. Yeah. So
I wonder if it's somewhat to do with if someone becomes famous and you then, as a celebrity, you feel like other people aren't treating you as they might have before you're a celebrity, and then there's this lure of aristocracy because that's sort of what they sort of give up on the idea of being a normal person to begin with. If you're an aristocrat, and so it's sort of like escapism in a way to try and join in with that other world, because the real world is closed off to you by your celebrity status.
I think that's a very good point, and it's also a two-way street, because certainly some of the aristocracy were wildly attracted by those who emerged from rock and roll. Certainly in the 70s, there was this kind of fairly...
Well, probably particularly in the 60s, actually, with the whole... The Stones became very... Well, we mentioned Jagger became very much a sort of magnet for the more debauched elements of the English aristocracy.
Absolutely.
You know, the Gettys and the Guinnesses and all of that.
Yeah.
My sweet Lady Jane, when I see you again.
The last of the pieces, funny enough, is Brian back at the Albert Hall in late 2002. Lisa Verrico reviewing the suave crooner, as she calls him, aged 57 now, playing to, quote-unquote, an audience mainly of women with 1980s hair and smart shoes and men with neatly trimmed beards.
Irresistible.
The vibe was a touch too cocktail hour at a posh hotel, but then that's always been Ferry's forte.
I mean, in his favour as a solo artist, he's provided steady employment for some very good musicians. Chris Spedding, for a long time, has been Ferry's guitar player of choice, and so on and so forth. You know, and he's obviously got good taste in a certain sort of limited kind of way.
Yeah, possibly sort of too good taste. I mean, I think many of his solo albums they're sort of tasteful to a point of perfection, sort of sterile perfectionism. You know.
I mean, it's such a shame, because those first two Roxy albums were so electrifying
and playful,
yes, and exciting. And you've got extraordinary songs like "Every Dream Home a Heartache," which is just magnificent piece of work.
Exactly.
You know, and then from there, via Roxy and Avalon and those sorts,
just becomes a bit bland, doesn't it?
A bit, very, very bland indeed.
Yeah,
and
maybe it's just that. I think when Eno left, that changed everything.
And the way in which Eno left is in itself interesting. Ferry hated the fact that this lunatic on one side of the stage with vast amounts of makeup and
giant like ostrich feathers on his back
was drawing the attention of the audiences.
I think that's right.
He resented that.
Yeah, I think so. Also free on Rock's Back Pages this week are 3 pieces by the excellent Mike Barnes, who's long been a writer on The Wire. Mike is just publishing this month, I believe it's 600 pages long. It is the definitive account of UK progressive rock in the 70s. It's called A New Day Yesterday.
It'd be a bit weird to write a short book about prog.
yeah.
Very good point.
Yeah, a sort of 3-minute version of prog. No, you're absolutely right. It has to be very long. Really, it should be published as a triple album, right? It's sort of tales from the topographic oceans in book form.
So if this is a 100-page book, does it mean that the short book has to happen?
A sort of short history of punk rock to follow on its heels. I mean, I haven't read it as yet, but I know it'll be very good because Mike is really good on all. I mean, his Beef Art book was absolutely terrific, and in fact, one of the 3 pieces is an excerpt from that Beef Art book, which came out in 2000, and it's an account of the making of Troutmask Replica. But we thought that the 2 most fitting of the pieces of his we have on RBP. A Wire piece on what was for him the epiphany of hearing Pink Floyd's Gummer at the age of, I think, 12 years old. And he clearly never recovered from this. One of his mates had an older brother who was the local head, 7 years older than us, tall, skinny, shoulder-length corkscrew hair, billowing loon pants. And they went round to Ant's, like, pad in Norwich, I think is where we are. And first record that Ant put on was I'm a Gummer. And he's just very funny, Mike, about hearing I'm a Gummer, which he calls the apogee of psychedelia and or self-indulgence run amok.
Mm-hmm. We were talking quite extensively about this in the office yesterday because Paul, our colleague, is, shall we say, something of a fan of Pink Floyd.
A little bit. He's got all of their albums and some of them multiple times.
Yes.
And I just remember that those Amagama Atom Heart Mother were perfect platforms to stick three Rizzlers together for the elaborate schoolboy joint circa 1970-71, you know. And I saw them in the park in, I think it was 69, supported by Kevin Ayers and the whole world, and it was quite possibly the most boring show I've seen in my entire life, with kind of the fairly loathsome figure of Roger Waters up front, screwing his face up at the angst of his lyrics, barking, "Careful with that axe, Eugene."
Right, which of course is a track on Amagama. And with magnificent bathos, Mike writes after this epiphany, the Amagama epiphany, he writes, "Cycling off in the dark to meet friends at the Blowfield Village bonfire party, a chunk had broken off Pink Floyd's universe and was whirling like a nebula inside my adolescent head. Everything looked different now, and life would never be the same again."
It's interesting, Pink Floyd does seem to inspire that kind of devotion and where people just get sort of like totally transported by whatever it is that they're doing. And yeah, I mean, he says life will never be the same again. I mean, that's a pretty striking endorsement of a band's music, that if listeners haven't noticed that there is some scorn being poured on Pink Floyd from the host of this podcast.
No, I mean, you know, first of all, you know, I'm just about too young to remember 1967, you know, being the oldest person in the room by a few
In the
years.
building, probably.
But they were really important in certain respects. Is that they were a liberating influence on a lot of bands that followed them. They were part of, even though they were a curious band, basically the original Syd Barrett version was split into two. There was the two acid heads and the two beer drinkers. Syd very much being one of the acid heads. And, you know, they were a very middle-class bunch, you know, architecture students and so on and so forth. They weren't good musicians. This to separate them off from prog.
Yeah, and Mike kind of alludes to
Yeah.
that. I think that's quite interesting.
They were pretty primitive players. Dave Gilmour coming in initially as alongside and then as a replacement to Syd Barrett, upped the game in terms of just technical ability to play. And in a way, it's kind of quite nice that they weren't. They were imaginative enough to try and do interesting things without much to do them with. So they got involved in all kinds of quite interesting, what we'd regard as art rock experiments with loop tapes and things like that.
Yeah.
So they were a pioneering band. We all love krautrock, for example, and I think there's no doubt that Floyd were a big influence on some of those German groups.
I mean, interestingly, Mike Barnes in this piece makes it clear that Amagama didn't lead to a lifelong devotion to Pink Floyd.
Interesting.
I mean, he says it's their most exploratory album precisely because they were prepared to take risks and overreach themselves at that point. And he actually says, you know, once they released the plodding Dark Side of the Moon, sorry, Paul, which they're still proud of, my interest in them began to wane.
Yeah.
Okay,
Which
fair
sort of
enough. That
leads
is
us
interesting.
to the second Mike Barnes piece, which is an interview with Peter Hammill, also from The Wire, in 2007, where inevitably he talks about Hamill's band, Van der Graaf Generator, who were very different from Pink Floyd, and in some ways much more influential on punk and post-punk. As proggy as they were, they were, I mean, I think much more interesting than Pink Floyd.
John Lydon was a fan of Van der Graaf Generation. I never liked them. I found them too angular and difficult, actually, in a curious kind of way. But I can absolutely see, we were talking last week about Andy Gill and the Gang of Four, that some of that angularity that the post-punk bands had actually has more to do with Van der Graaf Generator than kind of anything else. In
and particularly Hamill's solo album Nadier's Big Chance, which came out in 75 and was, I mean, it's no secret, it was a huge influence not only on John Lydon but on Marquis Smith.
Yes.
So Hammill was a bit of a hero to some of these emergent punks. There's just a couple of, I mean, I think he's a really interesting guy. I saw him perform once. I never saw Van der Graaf. I saw him do a show at the Bloomsbury Theatre, and it was actually just really, really compelling. He was a really compelling writer and performer. And So Hammill says in this piece, I think that historical perspective has collapsed everything down into a prog era. But what is often forgotten is that it was an extraordinary period of about 10 to 15 years from 1964 where something different was happening every year. But he says a little bit later, he says, I'm actually quite happy to be rolled into prog because it meant covers of magazines and all that sort of thing. But I think there was this element of aggression, of chaos that was there in our music. That wasn't generally there in what came to be known as prog rock.
Sure. I think that's absolutely spot on. That Van der Graaf generator had none of the pompous grandiosity of bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer in particular.
Or the Rick Wakeman era, yes.
Rick Wakeman era, yes, very much. I mean, my brother was, when I was a kid, he was buying albums by The Nice, who Keith Emerson was part of. And yes, his first three albums to me still sound absolutely fabulous, but they're almost closer to West Coast rock than what we'd now regard as prog.
Yes.
There's the use of harmonies, of song structures and songwriting, which is really rather fabulous. Wakeman joined. I saw them supporting Iron Butterfly, of all people, at the Albert Hall in 71, and they were fantastic.
Right.
They were Tony Kaye on organ, Steve Howard just joined on guitar.
Yeah, great players in their way.
But when Wakeman joined, now Wakeman's got a great track record. He played on some of the best Bowie albums, pre-Ziggy Bowie albums. He was in Straubs, all kinds of interesting stuff. But somehow he was liberated by Yes to produce the worst excesses of prog.
Yes.
And
as for his solo album, Six Wives of Henry
He's actually a very jovial figure. He occasionally turns up in TV programmes now. And
he's doing the podcast next week. Joke, folks.
But them themselves and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they're all the kind of the third-rate, second-division prog bands, of which there were huge numbers, playing the student circuit round England in the mid-70s.
What I think that Van der Graaf generator sort of nicely demonstrates is that the straight line or straight sort of opposite that people like to draw between prog and punk is a construction in a lot of ways. We actually, I think you were talking about that with Dorian Linsky the other week, where it's like these sort of neat narratives that get superimposed on eras of music. So it doesn't really work like that. There's always connecting bands and connecting movements and
also
things that
we forget
overlap.
how short the punk period really was. I mean, yes, it went on afterwards with the Oi bands and the Sham 69s and Angelic Upstarts as well. But, the pure punk period was basically 18 months. And rapidly, punk bands were saying, this isn't good enough. We can't keep playing three chords and shouting. So you got bands like the Slits integrating reggae and all kinds of stuff. And Wire, who we were talking about, and I think with Dorian Linsky we were talking about.
I'll bet Wire listened to Van der Graaf.
Absolutely.
Actually, I mean, all this is exemplified by this very funny quote from Hammill in this piece where he talks about Mark E. Smith of The Fall. He says, I last saw Mark in the Netherlands some years ago. Several beers were consumed over a couple of days, but not a lot of sense was made. But he says, I think we acknowledge each other as different sides of the same coin. Resistance to orthodoxy, I suppose. So, great piece about an interesting guy. And Mike's book is, to give it its full title, is called A New Day Yesterday, UK Progressive Rock in the 1970s.
Well, I mean, it's unmissable, I'd say.
I would say this, I mean, if you've any interest in that era, I know it will be a right riveting read.
And Mike's a very stylish writer, so it'll be a good read too.
And he's actually the other day was on Mark Allen and Dave Hepworth's Word in Your Ear podcast, so check that out too. So those are the three offerings on the home page, and now we turn our attention, do we not, Mark?
We do.
To?
Well, the first thing is our audio interview, which is John Tobler interviewing John Prine, the American's kind of country folk singer-songwriter.
Oh, joy, another country folk singer-songwriter.
Back in your box.
Thrilled.
Yes.
Back in your box.
You weren't supposed to comment that early with your heresies.
And it's a delightful interview. I mean, I can't say, we'll talk about Prine later in more detail, but he's someone who sort of slightly passed me by, even though I liked a lot of music in the territory he was operating in. But we'll kick off straight away with a clip because it's actually one of the first things he talks about, where the unlikely moment when he got to write a song with Phil Spector. Now, we were talking about this yesterday. There's a book to be written about all the people who've had run-ins or dealings with Phil
held
Spector.
hostage at Phil Spector's mansion.
It's pretty close. The 45 was produced, which we will hear about now.
He didn't like Al being with me. Al found out I was going up there with Hilburn, and Al said, "Can I come up too? I'd love it. I'd like to meet Phil Spector." I said, "Sure." I said, he didn't like the idea when he found out Al was my manager. He didn't like the idea of a manager being in his house, And he motioned to me to follow him in the kitchen. We went in the kitchen. He pulled out he had a 44 Magnum. He had a 3-piece suit. And he had a Christmas tree at the front door, right? And this is, it was well after Valentine's Day. And his kids all come down, running down the stairs in their pajamas. And his way of telling them that was, he said, "Who's the king of rock and roll?" And they go, "You are, Daddy, you are." Okay, this is Phil Spector's house. I go to the kitchen with him. He takes this 44 Magnum out. And he opens the door to the backyard. He sticks it outside. He says, "Okay, so I'm going to throw a chair around the room." He says, "And you holler." He says, "Like you're getting hurt." So he starts banging the chair against the refrigerator. I go, "Ah!" He goes, like this. He was doing all this for Al, to scare Al. Right. And he came out. We walk out of the kitchen laughing together, right? Arm in arm. And Al's sitting there going, and Al knew us. Al's going, he's going, he said, I think it was a 40 Ford or a 39 Ford. Like, he just talked like he totally ignored what's going on there. He's a real case, though.
If you don't want my love, if you don't want my love, if you don't want my love.
I mean, who's the king of rock and roll? You are, Daddy. You are.
Just because it takes on a slightly macabre tinge when we know what happened to Lana Clarkson. But as you say, it's not the only example of someone not being able to leave Casa Spector.
Well, the thing is, they were meant to write a song together, and nothing happened until he's leaving the door. He's actually almost halfway.
Phil hated people leaving.
Yeah, and then suddenly this sort of song emerged.
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. But so he talks about that. He talks about his favourite songwriters, about writing with Shel Silverstein. Very interestingly, he's a guy who got really disenchanted with the mainstream music business in quite a hurry. He had a rough experience at Atlantic, and then a rough experience at Asylum. He'd recorded his album Pink Cadillac, which was rough and readily put together with his own road band. And he took it to Asylum, and the guy at Asylum said, "Are you sure this is the record you wanted to give us?" And so he set up his own label in 1981. This is really pioneering stuff. It's still going to this day. It's actually had some...
Oh Boy Records.
Oh Boy Records. Some
boy.
degree of success. He also talks about, and we'll play a clip again right now, how in the mid-70s, the New York Times wrote this piece about the next Bob Dylan competition, and it's John Prine...
Loudon Wainwright.
Yeah.
Elliot Murphy. Yep.
And Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
And Bruce Springsteen, many years later, comes along to see a show and
a Prine show.
A Prine show. And let's listen to this. This is great.
There's a New York Times article in about 73, maybe, and it was like the new Bob Dylan contest. It was Springsteen, Loudon Wainwright, Keith Sykes, Elliot Murphy, and myself. Yeah. And it was this big article in the Sunday New York Times about who's going to be the new Bob Dylan, so the night he came down to see me, I did an introduction before Bruce had told the audience about this whole new Bob Dylan contest, and I talked about what happened to each one. I said, of course, Loudon Wainwright is Loudon Wainwright, and Keith Sykes lived in Memphis, and he was a record producer, but now he's an artist again, and it went on and on, And I said, of course, I'm stuck here with you. I said that this guy to do something completely different. I thought about Space. It was always like a 1,000-seater. The people, their heads like nailed against the wall. It was just like that. You know? They couldn't believe it. Like, at all. It's really neat.
If dreams were lightning, thunder were desire, this old house would have burnt down a long time ago.
She's very affectionate about Springsteen, Bonnie Raitt, you know.
Who done a number of his songs.
That's right.
Most famously, Angel from Montgomery.
That's right, rather beautifully.
Yeah.
And he said whenever he was in a given town, he had nothing to do with of an evening, he'd find out where Bonnie Raitt was playing, and even if it meant kind of like getting a plane to go and see her, He also talks about, he recorded a lot in Memphis, not the first location that come to mind when you think about him, but he loved those musicians. He also had an album produced by Steve Cropper. He's very funny about recording in Sam Phillips' studio.
Yes.
You tell the story there.
Yes, so Pink Cadillac was being done at, I guess, the Phillips International Studio.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. And apparently Sam comes by on the way to the bank, he says, right? And afterwards, Sam tells him, you know, I thought your voice was so terrible that I should stick around and see if I could fix it. So, look, we know Jasper really detests this kind of music. Anything...
He's squirming in his seat in agony. You know?
Anything with a hint of country in it brings Jasper out in hives.
Not anything.
But we're here to
most
defend...
Yes, we are.
...this kind of proto-Americana.
We were listening to some stuff in the office yesterday, and you, Barney, said... Steve Earle. You could really hear a lot of Prine and Steve Earle. And Prine has as much to do with that sort of Townes Van Zandt, Guy Clark, Steve Earle, Texas sort of aesthetic of songwriters, country / folk songwriters, as he's got to do with anything else. But he's before them.
Yeah. He came out of the folk scene in Chicago. I mean, it's weird because in the interview he really sounds Southern.
Yeah.
And he isn't Southern.
Well,
he almost became adopted.
No, he was born in the South.
He was born in Illinois.
Well, he talks about his home place being the same county that the Everly Brothers came from.
Okay.
So
I'm only going by... It's something called Wikipedia.
I wouldn't trust it.
Yeah,
Is that from that newfangled internet thing?
But he talks about his great friendship with Steve Goodman, who's more of a blues player, Steve Goodman, really, a sort of finger-picking blues player. But... he's charming in this interview.
He's absolutely delightful.
He really, really is.
And I think he's an interesting guy.
Yeah,
you know, even if I don't think he's the greatest singer.
No.
I don't think he's the greatest, like, chordsmith, as it were. I don't think his music is
interesting.
Is that interesting? I do think he's one of the great lyricists.
Yes.
The stories that he tells, the humour in his songs.
It's quite funny because John Tolber actually rather objects to this in the interview.
Yes, he
says,
does,
do you have
doesn't
to
he?
keep making jokes in your songs?
In the saddest songs, you'll drop a joke in.
And what does
he says something like that. No song too sad you can't get a joke in there somewhere.
I rather like that. That's quite a nice sentiment.
And he is a very witty writer and a very poetic writer. I mean, his famous songs are Sam Stone is a song about a Vietnam veteran who comes back to America and becomes a junkie. There's a great song called Donald Lee. That first album was a bit of a singer-songwriter classic. And you mentioned it was actually recorded with the American studio musicians in Memphis, but produced by, of all people, Arif Mardin. You know, he was on Atlantic, and you sort of think... I mean, there is a funny point in the interview where he says, I think Tober says, well, why did you leave Atlantic for Asylum? He did 3 albums also on Asylum. And he says something like, well, it just seemed to me like Ahmet Ertegun would just wanted to spend all his time with the Stones and Led Zeppelin. And I was only there because I was under contract, you know. I mean, I really enjoyed listening to him. And I am a fan. I can't say I'm, like, cognizant of his whole body of work, but I like the guy. He's had of course, some fairly heavy health issues over the years. He's had bouts with cancer, including, I think there was he had problems again last year.
Right.
But he's back on the road. He's touring Europe at this very moment. He won a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award.
Wow.
And interestingly, one of his bouts with cancer is he actually caused his voice to change noticeably. He got a much gravelier voice after one treatment that he had to have for...
Well, he couldn't even sing for about a year.
Sing for a long time, but then he had a much
extensive vocal
deeper,
therapy.
Yeah.
And the fact that without anything resembling mainstream success, I'd guess his first 2 or 3 albums were as big as they ever got. By setting up his own label, he's got independence in a way that very few artists do. He's managed to sustain a career. He can either go out, if he can afford to, he can go out with a small band, or if he can't afford to, he can go out just by himself.
Yeah.
He does say he's fed up with touring in this interview. You know, it's just travelling just gets too tedious. But Oh Boy is still a viable record label. It's still going, and that's 30 years. That's 40 years.
Yeah.
So that's pretty good going.
But I think he's had a sort of steady kind of career without any, obviously, like hits and stuff. But there've been
Big
successful covers of his songs.
Always good for the
And he
band
did win a Grammy for the album that had come out most recently when John Tobler interviewed him. This is 92. Was The Missing Years. That won a Grammy. And the title track is Prine's account of what Jesus did in the unrecorded years between his childhood and his ministry. I mean, that just sums up John Prine. It's just there's something just delightfully playful about him.
That's
Mostly
great.
the sonics of country music that put me off, because I love blues and I love musical storytelling and all of that, but a lot of country folk, I find it's so sort of interminable and it just happens, and I find it tedious, and I don't.
You're like my wife, who detests
in many respects,
country
still
music.
like Barnes' wife.
Yeah, we won't go into the other
about
things
that
they have
bit.
in common. No, but she absolutely loathes country, and I think for some people it's just a door that won't
I
open.
agree.
But what I do think is because probably when I was, how old are you now? 16, 17? I didn't really like country music either.
Off.
And actually, he's aged considerably since working at Roxy.
He sure has. He's haggard.
He's actually 23, but
That's
he
what
looks
working with
about
these two does to
31.
you.
But I think look, this is going to sound like a banal observation. I don't know what you think, Mark, but I do think as you get older, I think country music speaks to you more. I think just the emotion and the depth.
Partly
of it.
because it's not written for kids.
Yeah.
It's essentially adult music, or young adult music, maybe people in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
But a lot of country songwriting is directly from experience in a way that a lot of other songwriting
Hank
isn't.
Williams wasn't writing for Elvis Presley fans.
No.
I mean, I think that's the
Though
point. In a way.
But how do you explain then that I love blues? I mean, there's a similarity there.
But that's also you've got a general affinity like I have with African American music. It's a very different tonality. It's all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, but I mean, but it does have that storytelling, that experience.
You yourself were saying that you didn't like the tonality of country, and in a way, the tonality of country music is about sort of telling stories, and blues isn't massive storytelling music. It can do, but that's not central to it.
But it is experience based, and I think that it has much more depth and variety of tone. And
Actually, you know what? I have to say, Jasper, you say it has more depth and variety of tone. You haven't heard enough country music.
Yeah.
Brutally. I mean, everything from George Jones to Patsy Cline to Hank Williams. There's a huge
to Townes
range.
Van Zandt and those sorts of writers.
And all sonically extraordinarily different from one another. They are not the same thing.
I mean, I think Mark and I would both agree that essentially we like many more blues and R&B artists, but I think a singer like George Jones can move you as deeply as Aretha Franklin or Bobby Blue Bland.
George Jones is one of the great soul singers, without a shadow of a doubt. And then there's people like Willie Nelson, who's got almost more to do with the white jazz Bixby DeBeck tradition of the 20s and 30s, as he has to do with Hank Williams or anyone like that. So, and you've got Bell Wilson's Texas Playboys, who are basically the Count Basie Orchestra with pedal steel and fiddles.
And frankly, I think Steve Earle can be an extremely moving singer-songwriter.
Absolutely.
So stick around. We'll be sitting here doing the podcast in about 30 years, and Jasper will
finally
he'll say, I get it now. I was listening to A Good Ear for the Roses.
I mean,
last
the thing
night.
is, I don't say that there isn't good stuff. I think that the problem is, it could be that you're right, I just haven't heard enough good country. So much country that I've heard really genuinely does sound very similar.
Yeah.
And that twangy voice and twangy guitar. And
you're talking about the blues. A lot of people who don't like the blues say, well, that same old gravity voice, that same old twangy guitar.
It's not
different kind of twang.
Sure, country has changed massively in the last
It's horrible.
15, 20 years.
I'd say kind of
I mean, when you
country
consider that Taylor Swift, it was originally a country pop artist.
That kind of country
Yeah, well,
pop.
that's not what we...
I recognise that that's a different kind of music than what necessarily we're talking about. But sometimes it can be difficult to divorce the superficial sounds that are carried over still into country pop from the good stuff that has come before it.
But
and so
back when when I first
please feel free to play stuff.
We'll
that's
have to make him a
we'll
playlist.
tie him to the chair and just play him country music for the next 2 weeks.
I don't think we're going to convince Jasper today. We'll just keep wearing away at him.
Yeah,
But,
we will revisit this in a year's time and
yeah,
find it's become,
on the same day every year.
and he'll be George Jones's biggest fan.
Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, but I think that we're making slightly too stark an issue of this. It's not a question of, like, I loathe everything that is remotely in the ballpark of country.
That's pretty much what he said, wasn't it,
Yeah, when I said the audio this week's going to be John Prine, you groan like an animal in pain.
No, but he also played some of John Prine's music, and sonically it just... that's just it. Like, it's just... Whether or not the lyrics are good is boring as a sound to me. That's it, really. And I think
get it.
But as soon as you get more into the realm of soulfulness, and you get more into the realm of folk, there is stuff that I really love. So I don't think it's really as sort of simple as you're making out. But there you go.
We like to make things simple, don't we? And binary in this podcast.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about some of the new pieces, Mark.
Yeah, well, starting off with Starbeat, Mike Grant reporting on the Mersey scene. Mike Grant being an alter ego for dear Keith Altham, a long old friend of Rock's Back Pages. This is from Rave in April '64, and he writes one entire column just about the Mersey scene, which he didn't do often because he's very London-based, was our Keith. It is a blonde hairdresser, is said to be very much the apple of Ringo Starr's eye at the moment. She lives and works in Liverpool and is his constant companion whenever he returns home. A close friend who works with her told me Ringo brought her a lovely pair of handmade crocodile skin shoes back from Paris. And when he was in America, he spoke to her on the telephone for 45 minutes.
45?
In the local clubs and coffee bars, where Ringo is so well known that he gets no world star treatment, there is a conspiracy of silence over her identity. No one will talk about her. She doesn't want to talk about their romance, said her friend. She does not want to be pestered by people, and Ringo would be very angry if she was misquoted. Well, I guess this is Maureen. First, an early sighting of Maureen.
Must be.
She married Ringo, and she could have had Paul. That's why the lady is a champ.
Detroit Free Press, 1966, Lorraine Alterman, it's a brief interview with the Supremes, just got back from a tour of Japan and the Far East. And Mary Wilson says, the geisha girls were showing us how to dance geisha style, and we were showing them how to dance rock and roll, which is fabulous. And Florence Ballard in the same interview says, you don't buy potato chips in a bag like here. Instead, people snack on bags of dried fish and dried octopus.
Dried octopus. Wow.
A brief one is Charlie Watts of the Rolling Stones and the Pop Thinkin' Melody Maker 67 on Mick Jagger. I don't know if he's intelligent so much as bright. He's very bright, but I know more intelligent people, which I think is actually pretty astute. Same year, same paper. Paul McCartney is doing The Blind Date, where a star is played records, and it's Jimi Hendrix Experience Purple Haze. And Paul says, must be Jimi Hendrix. So Jimmy freaks out and sounds all the better for it. It's breaking out all over the place, you know. I thought it'd be one of those things that people might keep down, but it's breaking through all over. You can't stop it. Hooray! This is a good record too. I really don't know whether it's as commercial as Hey Joe or Stone Free. I bet it is though. Probably will be. Fingers Hendrix, an absolute ace on the guitar. This is yet another incredible record from the great Twinkle Teeth Hendrix. And of course, it was Paul McCartney who got Hendrix onto the Monterey Pop Festival bill. You know, no one in America knew about this American.
It's a great review. So it's a sort of like Blind Date with a single.
Exactly.
Like, who is this?
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
And Paul just nails it. And a year later, same artist, and this is Ann Moses, For the NME, sees him at the Anaheim Convention Center in Los Angeles, California. And she says, Jimmy's show was disappointing since his wild dancing and writhing were noticeably absent. And he blew an amplifier and only played 4 numbers in the second show. And in a way, you do the jump from the enthusiasm of Paul McCartney in the beginning of 67 to the beginning of 68.
It's barely a year.
It's barely a year.
Exactly.
And in fact, it was exactly a year. And kind of everything starting to go wrong with Jimmy is already starting to go wrong with Jimmy.
And it sounds like she's sort of expecting him to be this entertainer.
Absolutely.
This sort of,
spot on, Jasper. But one of the problems Jimmy had was that whilst he loved doing that, he didn't want to be just that. He also just wanted to stand up and play as well as he could. And as particularly the American fans were demanding this wild man act, you know. And we've talked about it before, but it's the stuff that wore him down.
Yeah.
Paul Simon interviewed again by Lorraine Altman. That's funny. I got
The great Lorraine Altman,
yes,
who we should point out may well be coming in. We hope to have her in on the podcast. One of the very first pop writers in the 60s.
Absolutely.
Certainly female pop writers. And she's going to be in London in, I think, early April.
Well,
and,
fingers crossed.
We've got her penciled in.
So good.
Tune in for that.
Interesting is Paul Simon actually says that he doesn't listen to lyrics. I mean, he writes lyrics, but when he's listening to music, he doesn't listen to lyrics. He says, of course, I write lyrics, so they're important to me. I want to say something, but a lot of people don't listen to lyrics. Then about Me and Julio in the schoolyard.
Yeah.
I can understand how people would read that into it, that being, is it a gay song? But as a matter of fact, it's not about a homosexual encounter. I would include myself in the rock world amongst the heterosexuals. A good songwriter like Jim Webb or Paul Williams feels compelled to go out and be an artist, and they're so mediocre. And you know, you like Jim Webb as an artist.
I won't stand for any criticism of Jimmy Webb, especially from that.
Well, there you go.
Smug little man.
He says everything the Beatles did was their own, but at the moment, I'm a believer is a good pop record, good for them. About the Monkees. That's you know, he's right. I believe it's fantastic.
Then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. Not a trace of doubt in my mind.
1975 record Mirror, Ian Dury being interviewed by David Hancock. Ian Dury at that point was still in Kilburn and the High Roads.
What a fabulous band name. Absolutely love it.
Who was sort of pub rock band, but they were with a twist. The weird thing about them is that they were a really weird bunch of people. And Ian Dury says, we've also been regarded as a bit peculiar visually. That's not ever been conceptualised. It just happened. The fact our drummer wore crutches and that Charlie the bassist is rather small is just one of those things.
Not to mention that Ian Dury was polio
Yes, so that's right. Well, that's in the context of him talking about him being a cripple on stage.
Exactly, yeah.
Who then went on to write Spasticus, Autisticus and things like that.
You know, one of his most famous songs.
82, very brief thing, a band called The Bangs, who were adding an L and an E into their name, became the Bangles in literally the next year. It's Mark Levinson for Music Connection and Los Angeles magazine, and they're playing Al's Bar. And at the end of it, he says, there's no question all the elements are here to make the group one of the biggest draws around. 1983 is theirs for the taking.
Well, I actually saw the Bangs.
Did you?
As well. In that year, probably almost exactly around then. Not that gig at Al's Bar, but they were doing some kind of showcase gig for IRS.
Right.
Which I think they were signed to at that point. And they were part of that Paisley Underground scene in LA, where all these groups, you know, were sort of referencing the 60s. And the Bangs was a very 60s name. Yeah, they were pretty good, you know. One of our friends, David Sigerson, of course, then produced them.
Did he?
He produced Eternal Flame, which was their huge number one.
Wow.
And yeah, Susanna Hoffs became... Did she do a record with Prince? I think Prince was very enamoured of her. But anyway, it was an interesting time to be in LA because of those bands like the Dream Syndicate, the Rain Parade. The Bangs were sort of like the girl group among that.
Well,
so it's interesting to
good
hear.
for Mark Levinson spotting.
Yeah.
You know, that's interesting. This is just funny. Jay Kordash for Cream, 1983, interviewing Molly Hatchet's Dave Lubeck. I mean, this man is just a prick of the first fucking order. So he says things like, Black Sabbath, to me, they suck a big one. I think they're sacrilegious. This is only my opinion, but there's no reason, when the good Lord gives you the luxury of success, to go in front of these impressionable people and give the sign of the beast.
Molly Hatch, what a great name.
What a great name.
I mean, they were fundamentalist Southern rockers.
Yes, they were.
I mean, they were from the South.
They were, yeah.
And, you know, I mean, he's deceased now, but one can only assume that he would be a fully paid up member of the Church of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's a fair bet. He also says, Boy George can sing. He's got a fine voice. he doesn't have to play a fucking faggot.
There you go.
no.
And there it
go.
is. There it is. 1983.
Yeah. In 1985, The Guardian, Adam Sweeting interviewing R.E.M's Mike Mills. Well, he actually interviewed most of the band, but this is Mike Mills talking. And he's talking about a journalist who had written... He wrote that the Delfwagos are a true Southern band and R.E.M. is not, because the Delfwagos songs are all about getting their paychecks on Friday, blowing them on Friday night, riding around in pickup trucks and drinking beer, and that is the essence of the true South, whereas R.E.M. might as well be from Chicago. And it's a good point, because, you know, in some ways, early R.E.M. as much about Southern Gothic as anything else. There was always a touch of sort of...
They were a very atypical Southern band. If you're going to write R.E.M. into the story of Southern rock, they're a real tangent.
We've yet to tag them as Southern rock
Yeah.
on Rock Spec pages, but they are also of the South.
They are of the South.
It's a different South.
I mean, they came out of Athens, which is, of course, is a college town, and it was very, very, like, indie-oriented. It was certainly a million miles away from the Molly Hatchet sensibility.
Well, I thought that was quite nice.
But it's a great juxtaposition.
But, you know, they did feel of the South and identify with the South.
In many ways,
Yeah.
you know, and those early album covers, they got this extraordinarily eccentric guy to do. I mean, it's the cover of, what was it most famously, like Reckoning. He was called the Reverend something, and his paintings were full of sort of strange Southern iconography, and so they didn't entirely disavow the South.
No. I mean, Mike Mills was resentful that one band is treated as a sort of Southern band just because of the kind of noise they make, whilst, you know, well, actually, you know, we are just a different part of the South. You know?
Different iteration of the South.
89, Enemy, Barbara Ellen, the splendid Barbara Ellen interviewing Debbie Harry. It's great. Or Deborah Harry.
Deborah at this point, Mark, let's get it right.
And she says, they said I was cheap, that I was exploiting my sexuality. It was quite the reverse of Madonna. I was 10 years too soon. And, you know,
I don't quite understand that quote, though. Sorry. No, what is she actually saying?
She's saying
there?
Madonna could get away.
She wasn't exploiting her sexuality.
No. She's saying that Madonna could do it and not be accused of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's
the treatment was reversed.
Yeah.
And then she talks about being a Playboy bunny in the Playboy Club.
Sure.
She says the club itself had surprisingly high standards. It wasn't at all blatant. The Playboy bunny waitresses never made guys sit down and buy them drinks. You know, she's basically saying, you know, it was a good job. And lastly, the terrific recent addition to our writers' stable, Stephen Daly, writing for The Face in December 1997. And it's when Texas, Charlene Spiteri and her fellow Texans went to work with the Wu-Tang Clan, which is one of the least likely kind of combinations I've come across.
I had forgotten all about it when you mentioned
I'm
this.
not sure much happened with it. And anyway, so he says, RZA has decided to dispense with the original master tapes shipped over from Britain. He wants a completely new version, recorded rough and ready without the standard safety net of a time code. This convention-trashing, wild-style approach to recording elicits some consternation from the studio's engineer, a central casting white guy who warns RZA, "You won't be able to sync to this, you know." RZA waves him away and turns to Johnny McElhone. Johnny McElhone being the guitar player with his Texas. "This riff is in E," McElhone tells RZA. "Maybe you should try it in the original key, D." "What are you saying?" "I don't understand no keys," says RZA. And it's a wonderfully descriptive bit of writing. It's, you know, when you sort of see films of hip-hop artists in the studio, and they basically turn the studio into a party. This seems, whether it's Dr. Dre or whoever, you know, everyone comes from their friends, half the people are writing lyrics, you know, writing words, blunts are being passed around, and basically this is what happens. RZA walks off with the studio sampler, $3.5 grand's worth of sampler at the end of the session, just can say fuck off to this engineer. Really? And they get banned from the studio, have to find another studio the next day.
That's great.
But Stephen Dale is such a good reporter.
Yes,
he's just, you know, good interviewer, good all that stuff, but he's a reporter, and I love good reporting.
Yes.
You know, and he's it.
Great.
What about you guys?
Well, okay, just very, very briefly, I'm slotting this in just in case next week's guest doesn't actually appear. I'll say no more than that. We're slightly on tenterhooks. We're hoping to have quite a big name for next week's episode. But this is a wonderful piece that Luke Turner, who used to work with us here,
lovely Luke,
an interview that Luke did with Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe, the Pet Shop Boys, for Stool Pigeon in May 2009. And it's just, I mean, they are such a joy to read in conversation. So smart, so witty. Neil talks about the 80s when everyone was hanging out at the Groucho, and he mentions the Star Bar at the Camden Palace. And he says, I was there once and George Michael came up and said, do you know who Jerry Wexler is? And Tanner goes, yeah, he produced Dusty in Memphis. He's amazing. And George goes, well, I've got this song, Careless Whisper. Do you think I should do it with him? I said, of course. Anyway, he goes and records it and he comes back and says, it didn't work out, so I produced it myself. I thought, oh, God. But of course, George's version is better than Wexler's version. So anyway, that was the early 80s, he says.
Fantastic.
And then there's another very funny Neil quote where Luke asks about, he'd been some sort of panel discussion about punk and post-punk, and Tom Morley of Scritty was on a Viv Albertine of the Slits, was on there, Colin Newman from Wire. And Neil, this is typical Neil sort of sociography, really. He says, well, what you want to do is ask yourself where they're from. They're Notting Hill Gate. You're talking West London. Now, West London has a pop culture which, as someone from Newcastle, I've always regarded with the deepest suspicion. Whereas your man from Wire was from Watford, which is practically the north of England. Coming from Watford is a very different thing from hanging out on the Portobello Road.
He's not wrong.
A great little
He's not
observation.
wrong.
I don't know why you're looking at me, Bo, when you're saying that.
Yes, Mr. Portobello. And then just the other quick piece is a great interview with the amazing guitar player Mark Rebo. James Med, who was one of our early podcast guests, interviewed Mark for The Word in 2011, and he talks to him, of course, about playing with Tom Waits and other stuff, and it's just fascinating, really. He asked him particularly about the track Jockey Full of Bourbon and how he kind of came up with the guitar sound for that. And Rebo's just wonderfully sort of poetic about it. He says what that actually is, it doesn't work based on blues licks like most rock solos. It works based on an older kind of solo that's based on chord arpeggiation. So it has something to do with Latin music, Cuban music, and Django Reinhardt. And he says that Waits works dramatically. He's a character in the song, and then it's my job to be someone who makes sense to have in the same room. He's a jockey, he's full of bourbon, and that places him in some kind of bar. But what kind of bar? It seemed to be a bar with a wide selection of lowlife. It could be in Marseille, or it could be in Havana.
That's great.
It's great, isn't
nice.
it?
Mark
nice
Rebo's
interview.
a wonderful guitar player. I mean, just if any of you want to listen to one album of his own, listen to the Rootless Cosmopolitans,
Right.
which is just fantastic. It's such a great record. You know,
Yeah.
again, referring to Spotify, there's yards of Mark Rebo on Spotify. Anything from jagged, abstract, out there stuff to almost kind of like rhythm and blues. There's one album where they just do funk tunes, classic funk tunes, him as band.
He's just
He's
amazing.
extraordinary.
I mean, because whenever he solos on a Waits
it's
track,
great.
it's never about showing off.
Yeah.
It really is. But sometimes it's just incredible. There's a solo on one Waits track, I can't remember which, where it's just a single note.
Yeah.
Just like going on for like several bars.
He's
It's
absolutely
just-
he's my top 5 guitar players without a shadow of a doubt.
in fact, he's playing on the Wire thing. You know his solo on Way
yes.
Down in the Hole.
Yeah.
I think is one of the great guitar solos.
You know, it's just-
but it's so spare and
Yeah,
simple.
absolutely. You know, you're absolutely right. He strips. I mean, you don't hear technique with.
It's not
Rebo.
about
You do
technique.
not hear
it's
chops.
not flashy or virtuoso.
He's got
at
the
all.
chops. You never hear them.
It's about character and
about
flavour.
All of that.
Jasper, young man, what have you got for us this week?
What have I got? I've got a couple of pieces.
Couple of
First which
pieces?
is yeah, what a surprise. First of which is an interview with Thol's Yanis Philippakis by one of our newest writers, Pip Williams. And interestingly, Yanis has a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a tough interview. He's had some sort of, not altercations, but he's a bit,
Prickly, can be a bit prickly.
But Pip said that the experience of interviewing him was actually very pleasant, and I think they were very young at the time of doing the interview, so Yanis was, I think, a bit more, almost a bit surprised, and was a lot kinder and quite fun to just to talk to. And it's an interesting interview. He's always quite freewheeling in interviews. So Pip asks, the video for What Went Down is really intense and visceral. What were the ideas behind it? Yanis goes, You know when you watch an Attenborough or a wildlife programme, you've got an animal like a lion, it's tensed and it's watching its prey, and the moment it charges in to chase its prey, the song feels like that moment. Pip asks in response to that, so if the album was an animal, it would be a predator. Yanis, I think the album as a whole is like something that's more multicoloured and can shapeshift or change. So it'd be like an octopus or like a cuttlefish. I love the idea of comparing your album to a cuttlefish.
I love that.
Second reference to an octopus in this podcast.
Gosh.
Dried octopus from the Supreme.
You're right, of course,
Gosh.
yes.
God.
See Life, the episode. The next piece I've got is Lianne Havas live at the Royal Albert Hall, seen by Stephen Dalton writing for The Times.
Tell us about, because I know you're a big fan
Yeah, I
of
love
hers.
Lianne Havas. I think she's sort of singer-songwriter. She's from South London. She's just charming. She's lovely. And I've seen
What's
her...
her style of music, in a way? I mean, when you say singer-songwriter?
Sort of jazzy, R&B-ish.
It's not country.
Not country, no.
Surprising, really.
No.
I saw her at Latitude Festival a few years ago, and it was sort of the first... she was afternoon slot at a festival,
Yeah.
and it was kind of the first time I'd seen her or heard her music, and I just fell in love on the spot, basically.
Yeah.
She's just a delight to watch. She's funny and quite personal on stage, even on a big festival stage. And Stephen Dalton I think he recognises that charm, but he also says her low voltage live persona could benefit from a dash of Amy's badass charisma or Beyonce's imperial swagger. She has stellar talent but lacks star quality. And I don't really think that's quite the right way to approach her music. She's got a fantastic Tiny Desk concert, one of the NPR series,
Yep.
which is just brilliant. And I think to expect that kind of badassery or swagger is slightly wrong.
I think what he maybe he's sort of saying that that's part of the job, you know, and to some.
It shouldn't have to be the part of the job for everyone.
No,
Not
no,
everyone can be Beyonce or Amy Winehouse.
No, I agree. But let's say, you know, if you've been reviewing live acts for years, you know,
You remember the ones with big charisma.
Yeah, but I mean, I remember her, and she was very charismatic, but not in a. She made it like a small room.
Sure.
She made the big stage feel
Well,
like a
that's
small
great.
room, and
Yeah.
I think
That's great
I think that
quality.
was, you know, she was
Yeah.
really talking to individuals in the audience rather than trying to be this larger than life persona. And
you don't
I
have
saw
to be
her
a
again.
diva,
I saw
do
her
you?
again at Afropunk, and she was great. She
Yeah.
was lovely. She just comes across as a really lovely individual.
Cause I know what I got, I know where we're going. You don't need to show it, I already know it all. It's what you don't do, it's what you don't say, it's what you don't do. I know you love me, I don't need proof. It's what you
And she's written some really interesting songs with. It's not just smooth. There's some edge to her music as well, and you know it comes across really well.
But, you know,
So I think
she's no Patsy Cline.
horse dead, beaten.
Horse? You couldn't bad my horse, boy.
Lastly, I went to see Caravan Palace a couple of weeks ago at the Brixton O2, and so I thought I'd just mention that I added my own piece to the archive.
Yes, it's a rice called Jasper
I fancy
Mirrison
that.
Bowie.
But I sort of felt compelled to write about the gig because I sort of went last minute, was given a ticket by a friend, and was kind of perplexed by the whole thing because they're a sort of electro swing group. Now, if you ask me, electro swing is sort of an inherently dubious proposition.
What is it, Just?
It's like
Electro swing.
club music, but with sort of the musical idioms of the big band and of swing
Okay.
music. And
Is there a whole movement here?
yeah, there's it really, I think, had its time in the sun or under the lights of maybe.
Grown under lights.
I've got hydroponic music.
Hydroponic swing.
Maybe 5-6 years ago,
Oh,
but
okay, God.
Christ,
We're only just coming.
but
to
it's still going, sort of. It's
Does it have a swing groove, or is the banging four on the floor?
it's pretty banging, but then with like, you know, horns and stuff.
So how old are Caravan Palace?
Oh, I don't know. They've probably been going for about 10 years, I think. I don't really
God.
know. I'm
Almost
I'm
as
honestly
old
not
as
sure.
me.
But what was weird about the whole thing was that on the one hand it was kind of weird and impersonal and a-human because of this contradiction at the heart of electro swing. On the other hand, it was just a lot of fun. Like, they were entertaining. It was a good laugh. Like, so I kind of came away going like, did I enjoy that? And I think the answer is yes, I did. But it was a bit weird at the same time. It's sort of like strange, where it was more purely entertaining than it was anything else. They had a dance on stage. Their stagecraft was
Not
fun.
Stacia.
That's going in next week, I believe. Yeah, I got to warn you. Next week we've got an interview with Stace from Hawkwind, which I can. It's all too brief. Brief's been the operative word.
Also next week we are hoping, as alluded to earlier, to be joined by a certain pet shop chap, but he's quite busy at the moment.
So
I was going to say a former Smash Hits writer.
What
We're covering our arses.
What Barn is saying, it probably won't happen.
It probably won't happen. Yeah, sort of naturally pessimistic. It may just be the three of us, or some stand-in. But we are hoping that Neil Tennant will come in and talk to us about his Smash Hits years, which could be very entertaining. If not, you'd just be lumped with us three.
Really kind of talking about country music again.
Country music.
We're going to go with another John Prine clip where he's talking about his brother teaching him to play guitar, and it's very sweet. It's worth pointing out that he had a long-term. His brother and he have been continue to be very close. His brother played with his band. His brother's also a physicist. I like the idea of a songwriter and a family with one son as a songwriter and the other son
blows
as a
my
physicist.
mind, man.
Well, Bonnie and I are going to mosey on down to the Grand Ole Opry. Jasper's going to go back to the office and do some work, and we'll see you next week.
Jasper's going back to Planet Electro Swing, and we're going down to the Opry. Whoever's here next week,
Cyberpunk Fairground House of Horrors.
Yeah, someone will be here next week to do this podcast.
Not necessarily me.
But thanks for joining us as ever.
See you next week.
Next time.
See you next week.
Bye.
Was he part of your becoming a musician? Because
he taught me how to play guitar.
Right.
I heard him play. He played the Freight Train, Elizabeth Cotton's Freight Train, for my father once in the kitchen, and I just was total awe because it was my brother, and I thought it was beautiful. He's playing this beautiful music, and it was just so odd to me. I was looking at a Martian or something. I thought my brother is actually playing that thing. I've seen people play guitars, but not my brother. And I asked him if he'd show me how. And I had a real problem as a teenager. I had a real short attention span. I was always off in another world. And it took something like that. My brother had my attention. And he said, if you pay attention, he said, I'll show you how. And he showed me how, and I just practiced. It sounded like nothing for 6 months. And then one day I took the guitar out of the case, and it was like as if by magic. All of a sudden, my hands were rolling across it.
Freight train, run so fast. Freight train, run so fast. Please don't tell what train I'm on. They won't know what route I'm gone.
That was John Prine in conversation with John Tobler in 1992, concluding this week's Rock's Back Pages podcast. The hosts were Barney Hoskins and Mark Pringle, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Murison Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. For a list of articles discussed and full show notes, please visit rocksbackpages.com/podcast. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews, at rocksbackpages.com.